Well, hey, everybody, welcome back to the Daily Six. Some good things the Lord's going to show us from Isaiah 53. Would you get it open? Isaiah 53. Come on with me. So I'm spending a warm summer afternoon here in the car, enjoying the air conditioning and sitting in the scriptures. And, oh, friends, there's something really good here. We've been studying all week how Jesus is the second of the 45 characters we're going to look at in the Old Covenant. God choosing Jesus to be the creator because he was the author of our salvation. God's impulse to create started with the idea of salvation, and he's our covering. You were with us yesterday. We studied how Isaiah 53 is the most prominent narrative, the most prominent prophecy in all the Old Testament about the coming of Messiah and the suffering that he would endure, that the cost of our salvation was enormously high. And Jesus boldly faced it in the Garden of Gethsemane. He gave God his will, said, all right, we're going in. And he did. So I've been continuing to read Isaiah 53. Do you have it open there? And in verse 10, I see something really interesting. I wonder if it'll catch your heart and mind. Where he says here that it was the Lord's will, it was God's will to crush him, to crush Jesus, and to cause him to suffer. Boy, that's a very painful thought, isn't it? That it would be God's will that would cause him to suffer. How does that even make sense? We'll keep reading this here in a second, but I want to show you something that my heart immediately sprung to over in Hebrews chapter 2 that talks about in verse 9, Hebrews 2, verse 9, that we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels. He's now crowned with glory and honor because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God, he might taste death for everyone. Think about this, that Jesus himself had to go through those same five movements you and I do, created for community. The crisis of sin turns the corner. Correction has to occur so we can get to the cure. Now, Jesus, for him, his crisis of sin was not his own sin. He never did sin. But it's as the book Corinthians tells us, we looked at yesterday, that he who knew no sin became sin for us. That was his crisis. And so in that, he tasted death. He tasted this Isaiah 53 crisis for every single one of us. But Hebrews 2, verse 10 tells us this, that in bringing many sons, and we could add there sons and daughters, right? It's not gender specific here. Bringing many sons and daughters to glory, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should make the author of their salvation perfect through suffering. Do you see that? It was fitting that God should make him perfect through suffering. In verse 10 of Isaiah 53, it was the Lord's will to crush him, cause him to suffer. Now, why? Well, he goes on and says, the Lord makes his life a guilt offering. That is a throwback to a sacrificial system we find earlier in the Old Testament, where God would say, oh, because of your guilt, the guilt of your sin, bring a sacrifice every year. A sacrifice would be a trade, it would be an offering. Let me bring you an offering and trade it for an assuaging of my guilt. But the book of Hebrews tells us in many, many places that never really worked. And you get this, right? That religious activity will never really cleanse your heart. And so what God had to do, he had to make the fair trade, not be an offering you and I can bring, but he made Jesus Christ himself, his life, a guilt offering. So here's where we're turning the corner. Jesus has been through this crisis. Now there's a correction occurring. As he has done that trade for us, here's how the text reads, that though the Lord makes his life a guilt offering, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. Why? Verse 11. Because after the suffering of his soul, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. He's speaking of the resurrection here, friends. In Hebrews 12:2 tells us that Jesus despised the cross. He hated it, hated every minute of it, as you would, as I would. But he says it was for the joy that was set before him that he endured the cross. And so he endures it. And after that suffering, that will of the Lord to take him through that process of being our guilt offering, after that, he's going to see the light of life, the resurrection. Down in verse 12. Therefore, I will give him a portion among the great. He'll divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death, because he was numbered with the transgressors. He bore the sins of many. He made intercession for the transgressors. Because of all this, God gives him the light of life. And Philippians chapter 2 tells us that because he humbled himself, that therefore, verse 9 of Philippians 2, God exalted him to the highest place, gave him the name that is above every name. Oh, friends, can you give God 6 more minutes here and just rejoice that it was the Lord's will that he would suffer for us, but because he was faithful, God took him and brought him into the greatest place of joy and abundance in life for you and me. And we can join him there. God has given him the name above every name, that every knee should bow and confess him as Lord. Can you give God 6 more minutes and just spend those 6 minutes confessing him as your Lord and thanking him for that wonderful sacrifice that brought us life? 6 more minutes. And come on back tomorrow for more of the Daily 6.